Good. It's working perfectly now. I'm really glad that I was able to adjust the iPhone to make sure that it's standing upright. The lighting is perfect. You can see me fairly clearly. And now, let's get on the way. Today is, of course, the 1st of April, or has been the 1st of April. I think it's fair to say that given the circumstances in the world today, April Fool's Day has pretty much been the last thing on the minds of almost everyone. And today also is actually quite significant in many ways because I'm about to do something that I've been meaning to do for quite some time. I never really had the time to do it, but I feel I must do it right now. I realise, of course, that there's a bit of a spot coming up over here where my left eye is, so I'll have to watch for that. Yeah, good. So I'm about to do something right now that I've been meaning to do, and that is make a video on the finale of How I Met Your Mother. Now, as many of you will know, 8 years ago, more or less to the day, the original finale for How I Met Your Mother aired on terrestrial television over in the US, and it was met with derision by many, many people for several reasons. A lot of critics panned it, saying that it completely disregarded the tone or went against so much character development and all that rubbish. And we've even had so many people on YouTube making reaction videos talking about their hatred for the ending, how they despised it so much. Well, I'm here right now to let you all know why I firmly believe that the ending for How I Met Your Mother, the original ending for that wonderful show, was an absolute masterpiece. Not perfect, mind you, but a masterpiece. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying that although I was a huge fan of the series, still am and still watch it on syndication whenever I can, I never really was a regular watcher during that time due to commitments and the fact that I could never have a TV at the best of times. But having watched the series at certain intervals and certain stages, I got an idea of what the story was about. And I am a little bit biased, of course, because after seeing Ted and Robin, I actually fell for them in many ways. They were, of course, the couple which started the series. Although it started with Marshall Erickson proposing to Lily Aldrin, Ted Mosby was the one, of course, who was telling the story, and it was effectively about how he met Robin Scherbatsky in that classic sailor meets the girl across the bar scene and said, "See her? I am going to marry her someday." And thankfully, as I will tell you, that did in fact happen. It was sad, of course, what happened to the mother, Tracy McConnell, who died, but of course she was dead at the beginning of the story. One of the biggest inspirations for me doing this video is the fact that, as I've mentioned, there were so many reaction videos done for the finale of How I Met Your Mother. One of them in particular went on for 25 minutes and was nothing but an angry rant from some clueless person who claimed to be a fan, but in reality showed that he had a pretty poor attention span and never paid attention to so many things that were mentioned in the series. And again, Carter Bays and Craig Thomas, the writers and producers for this series, had their own method of storytelling, very non-linear and with a lot of flashbacks and flash forwards. You know, you either have to pay attention to the series in its entirety, or you just watch it and enjoy it as it happens without assuming anything. Enjoy it while it lasts, if you will. Now, there are many issues with the finale that still stick in the craw of many fans today, and that pretty much forms the basis of their hatred for the finale, and I'm going to talk about them right now. One of them is this claim that by adopting the original ending, Bays and Thomas completely destroyed all of the character development that took place throughout the series just so that they could get their shock ending. You know, character development is a bit of a nebulous concept in itself in many ways, and what seems to be apparent is that all of this character development which took place in the eyes of the fans was really how they perceived it to be and not how it effectively was. And there have been for every single comment talking about how, yes, there was a lot of character destruction, there were even more measured people who said, sorry, that's not the case. Everything panned out the way it was meant to pan out. I'm also going to take some time right now to shout out a few people who have themselves inspired me by their own views and their own support for the ending, and how I find myself more in alignment with them, and am able to offer another perspective as well, which moves along with, which meshes with that perfectly. First shout out goes to a really good friend of mine, and one who has been really aggressive in defending the finale. He goes by 44 Excalibur on YouTube. Shout out to you, buddy. I hope you're well. Now, he's made many comments where he has spoken at length about why he enjoyed the ending as a Ted and Robin supporter. To that point, of course, I'm wearing a blue shirt for the blue French horn. Oh yeah, blue French horn over yellow umbrella. Sorry, that's just the way it is. As I've said, this friend of mine wrote many comments on YouTube, some very lengthy ones, talking about why the ending was the correct way to end, why it had to end that way, and about all of the things which were mentioned in the story, and how everything was tied together beautifully, and how many people who weren't able to appreciate the finale simply couldn't grasp all of that or appreciate all of that. Not just 44 Excalibur, but other people like Arthur Chazal, Regina Phalange, who now goes by Amber D on YouTube, and several others who have spoken about how they agree with me. Paulita, Saiso. I don't know if you're going to watch this video, but if you do, I'm giving you all the shout out. And I've been told that I have to produce a video by some of these people, so here I am. Now, now we're going back to the issue of character development. As I've said, the character development that people claimed was destroyed was really only the perceived character development by those fans, due to how much they loved certain characters in a way. But character development was there, and it wasn't really tanked in any way. The biggest issue with Ted was that, according to many people, he was supposed to have moved on from his sort of puppy-like fantasy over Robin to have found a more mature, meaningful love with Tracy McConnell. And sadly, even if Tracy McConnell had to die, he should never have gone back to her. So, according to many people, he was an idiot for, going after Robin when Robin apparently didn't love him back, which is completely untrue, and I will talk about that later. Of course she did. And he was another idiot for going back to her after Tracy McConnell died. Tracy McConnell obviously had to die because that was the way she was portrayed, as being dead when Ted started telling the story. She died in 2024, and in 2030, in medias res, it had been 6 years since she had died. And we found that out in the finale, but there were many clues leading up to her death, and I'll talk about that later. But actually, his character development wasn't destroyed. There have been several people, and I am going to talk about one particular channel. I'm not going to name them and shame them because, they might possibly come after me. Yeah, if they come after me, I don't care. Life's all about mind and matter. I don't mind. Haters don't matter. But they've pretty much portrayed Ted as the archetypal nice guy who isn't really quite nice. And in the first season, for sure, he did a lot of horrible things, like cheating on Victoria with Robin, and was, trying to... He even had that issue with Mary the paralegal, which is also quite terrible. He, in many ways... His early seasons were sort of the framing of him. The framing of him as someone who wanted to find the love of his life, who wanted to, experience the feeling of romance and marry for romance, if you will. And especially when he met Robin, he was besotted with her, but also had to struggle with his desire for perfection, if you will. He always had that checklist in his head about what his perfect girl would be, what interests she would have, and what she'd be like. Now, of course, when Ted met Robin, and when they had that date at the restaurant from where he stole that blue French horn, it was revealed that they had some similarities. Maybe not completely similar, but, that's sort of how it planned. And that is what kind of brought Ted and Robin together, because of those similarities, which are more than enough to make them a more believable couple, if you will. They certainly weren't clones of one another. They had different interests, and they had different ideas, they wanted different things, but when they got together, they were absolutely a wonderful couple, and I loved them a great deal. And so he was in the framing as trying to understand how to be in a relationship, in that sort of a relationship, and certainly his relationship with Robin was one which made him happy. And his biggest problem was that yearning for perfection did sort of peck at the back of his head. He also was so obsessed with the idea of romance and finding that perfect one, without even realizing in many ways that concept was a little bit, non-existent in a way. When you find love with someone, you accept that person for who he or she or they are, regardless of whatever flaws they have. And although he never realized it at the time, or maybe he did, but he didn't want to think he realized it, he and Robin were perfect for one another, and that was summed up by his quote late on in season 1, before they got together. I don't want perfect, I want Robin. And of course, when they got together, after Ted making it rain, I should have added the air quotes, because obviously you can't make it rain, although Elvis Presley could beg to differ. He always would say that if you have little faith, you can stop the rain. But the way they were set up together was just so momentous and so powerful, and you simply can't make that sort of an effort to do that, as 44 Excalibur said, unless you have plans of them ending together in the end. A little bit like Ross and Rachel with, that iconic kiss at Central Perk and Friends, and also later on when they had their baby. You just knew they had to end up together in the end, otherwise it would have been a huge rip-off. And so, as the seasons went on, he had to deal with how much he had lingering feelings for Robin, and how he started to realize that, she was the one he really wanted, but also trying to grapple with his own wants from life, wanting a family, wanting children, and so forth, when Robin wasn't really interested in marriage or children at the time, but as we know, as we found out later on, she wanted the option later on. And of course, when they broke up, Robin did make that iconic line, "If I were to have someone's babies, I'd have your babies." I mean, they were besotted with one another, really. And ever since Ted broke up with Robin, his attempts to move on with different people would always, they wouldn't be successful. Partly in many ways because he was still in some way hung up on Robin, but even when he was about to marry Stella, you always had that feeling that Robin would play a role in bringing that relationship to an end, and that's sort of how it worked out in a way. And ironically, that was one occasion when Robin told Ted not to go through with the marriage, giving you an idea that she couldn't get over him. Every single relationship was a means of him trying to learn a lot more about himself, and to try to understand and get and sort of understand the fact that love isn't simply about trying to have the perfect person, but trying to find that person who, flaws and all, will give you that level of happiness. Eventually he did find that with Tracy McConnell, but what the worst part is that people often believe that she was the one who gave him that peace, and she was the one who made him whole. That's not quite true. I remember 44 Excalibur saying that in many ways Tracy was just a representation of everything that Ted had been doing wrong, searching for a perfect woman, or that one, without realizing that it never really existed. And of course, in season 8, before that wedding, Ted had in fact declared that he had had enough of dating and was willing to settle down, no more looking for romance. And even then, he was still struggling with letting Robin go, and finally when he was able to let Robin go and marry Barney, he had in fact, of course, made that tumultuous decision to leave New York for Chicago. But then after meeting Tracy, he decided, you know what? I think I'll stay. And you could tell when they started dating that it was going to be a lot more different from his other relationships, because He wasn't going to try too hard. He wasn't going to do something like a 2-minute date, or, try and steal some Smurf genitals, or make it rain, or do any of those gestures, because he didn't need to do that. All he had to do was just, be himself, be simple, and let things work out the way they would. And that's how that happened. So he had some character development, and it wasn't taken away. And those people who call him stupid for running back to Robin must understand that by that time, they had rekindled their spark. They rediscovered the love they had for one another, and the circumstances were that it was 6 years since Tracy had died. He had the right to move on, of course. So his character development was just fine, and that was how it progressed towards the finale, and that's how it culminated. As for Robin, she, in many ways, her character was in the framing too, and she had many different layers. Brought up like a boy by her father, despite being born a girl, she eventually rebelled and moved in with her mum and became a teen pop star, then a grunge artist, and then a journalist back in Canada before moving to New York and finding a new job. And she had many different layers and many different contradictions about her. And, she was often portrayed by many fans as being this selfish person who never gave any effort during her marriage to Barney and just allowed it to go completely kaput because for her career was more important. That was completely unfair. She was willing to give up her career for love, only for that person, Don Frank, to, betray her and just move off to Chicago himself because that job was his big opportunity, his big break. So ever since then, she developed more of a once bitten, twice shy attitude, really. And her own development was realizing that despite her desire for a great career and a great life, she also wanted to have the option of marriage and children and motherhood. And when it was found out that she was infertile and didn't conceive, not just couldn't conceive, but didn't conceive, the depression that she underwent that time was clear for all to see. And for people not to see that, that's just, it's just dissonance, really. So even her character was definitely in the framing throughout the entire series, and she was able to somehow mellow down and realize that after having the life she wanted, she also wanted to eventually settle down. And that was also proven in the finale on the DVD, when we found out later that she had settled back in New York, had a quiet life, having achieved whatever she wanted to achieve, and was ready to reconnect with Ted, rediscover the spark that she had always had for him. And that's how it works out as well. And she went on to become a loving de facto stepmother for Ted's children, Penny and Luke, taking them on trips to the beach and the zoo, coming over to their house for dinners, coming over dressed in crazy costumes for Halloweens. And everything that was mentioned was meant to portray her as someone who was still in the present, very much a part of the lives of Ted's children, and also eventually Ted. And she also she definitely developed from being, in the eyes of many people, ambitious and somewhat heartless, to becoming someone who really wanted love like anyone else. And in many ways, Ted was that love which gave her that peace and that tranquility. And she had that in season 2. But they also were right to break up. But in the end, just as everything came back to Robin for Ted, everything came back to Ted for Robin. And a lot of people don't realize it, but she leaned on him and loved him and adored him and depended on him more than people will even know. And that character development is reflected in how she was able to realize that, how she was able to finally express love. She never really had it easy, because her own upbringing by her father and her own life story meant that she found it difficult to express love that easily. And that's one thing a lot of people don't really pick up on. They seem to have the idea of Robin as being this, badass chick who loves guns, who can fight with a bow and arrow, who has a lot of interests that same interests as boys do, and because she and Barney have the same interests, they were simply perfect for one another. Rather shallow, to be honest. And they still have the gall to blame Robin for the failure of her marriage to Barney, while ignoring the fact that Barney at that time was still, even after marrying her, an immature little child who was going through a Peter Pan phase and expected his partner to be a mother figure to him. And now I'm coming to Barney. You know, I'm old enough to remember Neil Patrick Harris as Doogie Howser MD, as is, I'm sure, a lot of fans. And obviously, given his talents as an actor and a singer, he became one of the fan favourites of the show. And he obviously was one person who, like Robin, had a very difficult childhood with his father having abandoned him, his mum, you know, doing her best for him, but not exactly, you know, being what one... I mean, it was a dissipated life, and I'm not going to, you know, go further into that, but she really did her best to bring up both Barney and his half-brother James the best she could. And we got the sense, I certainly got the sense, and certainly it was mentioned very well by 44 Excalibur, that the real reason why Barney wanted to be in a relationship was not because, you know, he necessarily loved women that much, but because he wanted to, you know, make up for his dissipated childhood. He did have a girlfriend, Shannon, who left him for his future boss at GNB, and that was when he started to change and become more of the womanizing playboy that he became. Someone who was a lot more, you know, stylish, into suits, into money, a little bit like the characters of Mad Men, if you will. That was one facet, but the other facet was obviously his childhood. And he never really understood the importance of being able to change his personality, change his attitude, change his mentality to be a good boyfriend or a partner for the woman that he loved. Whether it was Robin or Nora or Quinn or anyone else, he just wasn't really that capable. And of course, that man was a womanizer. Once sold a woman, mind you. Slept with how many women in New York City? And you could say that that arrested development in childhood contributed to how his own character was at the time. Someone who always wanted to live life in the fast lane. Someone who always wanted to, you know, just have a little bit of fun, a bit too much fun, if you will, without any concerns for, you know, what would happen afterwards. And even as a partner or a boyfriend, in some ways, he didn't really like feeling emasculated. And that's sort of how it played out as well with his marriage to Robin, because he couldn't handle being Mr. Robin Scherbatsky. He was simply incapable of taking a back seat and allowing his wife to continue to shine in many ways. It wasn't simply out of frustration that Robin wasn't there all the time. I mean, with her career taking off, she couldn't just, you know, abandon all of that. He couldn't understand that either. He still, in his heart, was that same young teenager or, you know, early 20s person who felt that he had the world at his feet and wanted to do whatever he wanted. And he was never really able to mellow himself in many ways. And he confirmed that in the finale by saying that if Robin wasn't able to change him for the better, then nobody could. I actually believe, in fact, that Nora had some wonderful success in making him a better person, and if he hadn't have cheated on her, that would have been fantastic in the end. Quinn was, I'll go back and forth. But the one thing which did make him change was the birth of Ellie. Yes, it was from a one-night stand. Yes, it was from a stupid dare about sleeping with 31 women over the course of a month. But when his child was born, you could tell that that was what he wanted. He wanted to be that strong father figure that he lacked himself growing up. And when he got that opportunity, he realized, you know what? I have something right now which is more important than me or any of my issues, and I'm going to make sure that I change myself and my character to be the best father I can be for this precious little girl. That's his character development. And there were many signs, in fact, that he really wanted that responsibility. In fact, near the end of season 1, when Ted and Robin were sharing a dance at a high school, he was seen, with a little child holding that child. And you could tell that brought him some peace. And then, of course, after he broke up with Nora and Robin refused to get back together with him, he came up with the idea of being co-parents to a child, only for him to be talked out of that by saying, no, you got to wait for the real thing. So again, there was character development for him as well. The only problem is it wasn't the character development that fans wanted for him. And I talk about characters being in the framing because there is this other person on YouTube called Mark Grandin. He's Canadian, and he offers these reviews of television programs and films for his channel called Spectrum Pulse. I'll share that link, where he also spoke about how he felt Barney was in the framing and that Robin was the love that would make him complete, make him whole, and really help him develop. But to his frustration, to Mark's frustration, all it took to teach him some vestige of responsibility was to give him a bouncing baby girl from a one-night stand, and family values saves the freaking day. He clearly didn't like it. I mean, Neil Patrick Harris's acting was wonderful in that scene, but there were some people who simply weren't willing to buy it. They just didn't want to buy it because they wanted to see Barney happy with a partner, not simply a child. Maybe in the future, he'd emulate his mother and find love in his 60s or 70s. You just don't know. Maybe after raising Ellie, he'd be a lot more mature and grounded. You don't know. And of course, when you consider Lily Alder and Marshall Erickson, who were pretty much joined at the hip, they had their development. Obviously, they had a few quirky moments and a few eccentric moments, but they also gradually mellowed to becoming mellowed parents to 3 children. Might have been more. We don't know. But, so that's the way it was. There was no destruction of character development by the original ending, and people who still say that need to understand that the way the story was told, there were several clues and hints thrown in that would lead up to the ending that would really give an idea of that level of development. And, we just had to accept those hints, or at least enjoy that while it lasts and try and piece everything together. We were challenged to think about all of those things. It was structured like a murder mystery, and now you have an idea why Ted Mosby would always say that as a child he was a bit of a detective. So that's one issue. Second issue is the issue of the love triangle between Ted Mosby, Robin Scherbatsky, and Barney Stinson. Now, there was another series, of course, based on a love triangle, Dawson's Creek. I never really got around to watching that, and a lot of people have cited that series as an example of how the writers, did the brave thing and the correct thing by changing their storyline because apparently it didn't fit the tone, or, it didn't reflect the evolution of the characters and all that rubbish. Sorry, but I'm going to say later that that's a bit of a cop-out, but more on Dawson's Creek later. The issue of the love triangle between Ted, Robin, and Barney is one which still has people divided to this very day. I mean, I will say right now that another motivation for me doing this video is the fact that I have gone on many videos of Barney and Robin, and whenever I've read some of the comments talking about how beautiful a couple they were, I would often make some snide comment about how they weren't really all that, and people would just come at me and say, "Ha! Angry Ted and Robin fanboy. You don't understand what an unconventional relationship is. You're just a Barney and Robin hater. You're a simp." All of that rubbish. People, for some reason, hated Ted and Robin so much because they got together at the beginning of the series and they broke up fairly early at the end of season 2. And many people, in fact, did only start watching the series at the beginning of season 3. So they assumed that Ted and Robin were simply not the real deal. And many of them also were really intrigued by the concept in their mind that because the series was called How I Met Your Mother, if the series began with Ted meeting someone who wasn't the mother, but who was the children's beloved Aunt Robin, they had this idea, he meets this amazing girl, and she may not be the one with whom he ends up in the end. As we can see later, that concept proved to be rather flawed. Because, I mean, you know, she was called Aunt Robin, but she wasn't Ted's sibling by any means. And in fact, when they got together, they actually shared a truly beautiful relationship. I say beautiful because, you know, almost similar to Ted and Tracy. I mean, granted, Ted did have to go through a lot of trouble to finally get together with Robin, but once they were together, you know, that was actually a relationship that made them blissfully happy. You know, they complemented each other perfectly, and they brought out the best in one another. They may not exactly have had similar interests, but they certainly had similar personalities, similar senses of humour. The Moxaloots joke is one of my favourite gags. And more importantly, they brought out the best in one another, because he was able to make her more emotionally available and loving. She understood the joys of being in a long-term relationship with an amazing person. And in turn, she was able to keep him grounded and minimize his self-centered tendencies. And when they were together, whenever they had any arguments, they weren't really that big. They were able to resolve all of their arguments in a very loving, cooperative manner. Like one such example being in Stuff when, you know, they had that issue with Robin's dogs. They resolved that eventually by agreeing to move in together, only for Barney Stinson to completely muck all of that up because he suddenly became jealous of Ted, having, you know, secured a beautiful girl like Robin Scherbatsky as his girlfriend. And that's the way it really panned out. A lot of people would say that because Ted and Robin didn't move in together, they simply weren't meant to be, but they conveniently forget that Barney was the one who was being an active spanner in those works. And if it hadn't have been for his stupidity, if it hadn't have been for his immaturity, his childishness and his jealousy, they probably would have moved in together. And they would have resolved some of their problems. And even if they didn't move in, you know, at that time, it sure as hell didn't mean that they weren't willing to move in the future. And of course, in the future, they did become roommates. But again, as I've said, they never had any major fights, and they were never ever happier than when they were together. You seriously think Robin was happy with Barney? Please, pun intended. I'm going to come to that very soon. But as I said, Ted and Robin were never happier than when they were together, and, you know, after they broke up, both of them were struggling with that. You know, Robin herself mentioned at the beginning of season 3, despite dating Gael, played by Enrique Iglesias, that she would cry every day thinking of him. And she also had her struggles in trying to move on from Ted, as much as Ted struggled to move on from Robin. But, you know, they both eventually had to move on from one another and do their own thing. And that's what they said in season 5 when they met together and ended up making that single at 40 deal. And again, people will say, that is the most unromantic thing I've ever heard of. Maybe you have a point, but in some ways it's actually quite wonderful. Whisper it softly, I have a similar deal. And, you know, the story showed how they were able to lean on one another. When Robin broke up with Don, she ended up moving back in with Ted. She would always lean on him and trust his counsel more than Barney, despite going on to be engaged to him and marry him. Fat lot of good that did. But the story also showed that in many ways, as I've said, that Ted was the love which made Robin at peace, which gave her tranquility, which made her so happy inside. And it hurt both of them that they had to break up because at the time they wanted different things. But they certainly didn't they did not love one another at all. Got it right. They always leaned on one another. They always loved one another. And yet many people just ignored those signs. And so the story of How I Met Your Mother, based on Love in the Time of Cholera, dictated that eventually, because those two lovers couldn't be together at that time, they would eventually reunite at their old age when they'd done everything they wanted to do. And that's how it worked out. And that's what made me feel quite happy, as sad as I was for Tracy's death. As for Barney and Robin, never ever felt it. Never believed that they were a good couple. Never liked them together. Barney in many ways was, for all of his womanizing and his attitude, he was actually a dependable friend and provided a lot of the greatest moments in the series' history, whether it was flying all the way to San Francisco to bring Lily back to New York, whether it was getting Marshall Erickson the job at GNB when he needed a job and he needed money, whether it was getting Ted the opportunity to design the new GNB building, or whether it was saving Robin from getting deported by getting her that job at Come On, Get Up New York on Channel 12, I think it was. Yes, 12. He was in many ways a good friend. But as a boyfriend and as a fiancé and as a partner, he sucked. And with Robin especially, he was never able to evolve and change and become that person, that dependable fiancé or boyfriend or partner who would help make a marriage last. Especially with Robin, for me, I got the sense in many ways that he never really loved or cherished her. In fact, his entire relationship with her was founded mainly on, sex. Let's think of it this way. He slept with Robin in sandcastles in the sand after comforting her over her issues with her former Canadian boyfriend, Simon Tremblay. And the comforting was good in many ways. But sleeping with her, going against his bro code, that wasn't really cool. And instead of confronting his feelings for Robin, whatever feelings he might have had, his biggest concern was realizing that he broke the bro code and having to try and hide it from Ted instead of being honest with him about it. And he was always this sort of a person who would sleep with women and never call them again. So with Robin, it was more different because he would see Robin every day. And Ted obviously never knew how Barney would treat Robin afterwards. He probably thought that Barney would just treat Robin like one of his other one-night stands and just, completely ghost her afterwards. He had the option to be honest with Ted about it and didn't do that. And even then, when they eventually did get together in season 5, again, I've made it crystal clear that the only reason why he wanted to be in any sort of relationship was to make up for his dissipated childhood and arrested development. But he could never really evolve himself. He was never really able to become that person who Robin wanted and Robin needed. And ironically, in the earlier part of season 5, he took some classes from Ted on how to be a good boyfriend. And Ted was willing to acquiesce because he realized that, with Barney falling in love with Robin, he realized that maybe, there was something in Barney that was in some ways genuine, and he was willing to help out. And I think he was willing to appreciate the fact that Barney was taking a lot more efforts to try and keep Robin in his life, although ironically, in that earlier on in that episode, he wasn't exactly, a nice person in many ways. I mean, Robin had some depressing news. And you know what he told her? You need someone to talk to. Go to Lily and talk to her and come back when you're ready to have sex with me. Disgusting. And he also continued to visit strip clubs in season 5. And there's always this sort of an idea among Swarkles fans, that is Swarley plus Sparkles. Quite clever. There's always this idea among fans of Barney and Robin that Barney truly loved and valued Robin for who she was, while Ted really only considered Robin to be his dream girl and wanted to project his idea of perfection on Robin. I'm going to dispel that right now. People talk about this "you are your own daddy" speech. Let's completely, analyze and take a look at that. It's in the Baby Talk episode that Ted basically tells Robin that sometimes, Robin never really made him feel needed. Robin would always take charge and do a lot of things, and he said, it is nice to be needed at times. And people would look at that and say, Ted gave her crap for that. Ted never really loved her independence. Whereas Barney, on the other hand, would say, nobody's going to say who's your daddy to you. You're your own daddy. You're independent, you're strong, and you are the most awesome person I've ever banged. So that last part of that speech over there should sum it all up. He basically saw, he was never really able to evolve beyond that paradigm of having sex with people. And that wasn't really a sign of how he truly loved Robin for who she was. He just loved the idea that because she was independent and never really needed him, he could do whatever the hell he wanted. And that actually led, in fact, to the incident where, despite cheating on their partners with each other, Robin was not willing to get back together with Barney, because when Robin ended up asking him later on, what you see in me, I'm such a mess, his more honest response, rather than the more rehearsed speeches he gave, was, well, I guess you're just as messed up as I am. And that summed it up. He never saw Robin as anything more than a reflection of his own flawed self, and never truly appreciated how great she was. Maybe in some ways he did, or maybe he just appreciated the parts that he liked, and that sort of summed it up. In stark contrast, what Kevin said was enough to make her realize that she had a chance for something better with Kevin. Anything better than what was possible with Barney at the time, and with a person who truly loved her for who she was. And that's why she refused to get back together with him. But the best speech about how Robin was valued came at the end of season 5. She had broken up with Don, was in tears, and went back to Ted's apartment and asked him if she could move in with him again. And again, that is an example of how she leaned on him and trusted Ted more than Barney. And when she asked Ted, am I just an idiot? Ted said no. And then went on this entire talk, the We Are Our Own Doppelgangers talk, about how over the course of time we change and become different people, but awesome in a different way. The Doppelgangers gags was also quite fun. We should have seen a lot more of Lesbian Robin, in my opinion. We saw more of Mustache Marshall. We saw a whole scene of Mexican wrestler Ted. We saw a lot of exotic dancer Lily, and we also had plenty of scenes of the fertility doctor of Barney, but not enough of Lesbian Robin. I think Lesbian Robin is really, that was something which was really inappropriate. I think Tomboy Robin would have been a lot better. But, maybe they wanted to laugh or so. But again, back to that speech, what Ted basically told Robin was, 5 years ago, I made an ass of myself trying to chase after you and make you my girlfriend. And now, you're one of my best friends. The Robin I met then was wonderful. But the Robin I know now, my ex-girlfriend and one of my closest friends, is pretty darn amazing. And what was her reaction to that? She was leaning in to kiss him because she realized how much he loved her and how much she also loved him in return. And they would have kissed, but for Ted's blonde hair. Of course, Ted did say that it was a good thing they didn't kiss and end up having sex, because that probably would have been something at the moment that they might have regretted, or maybe they wouldn't, I don't know. But it probably would have changed the storyline in so many ways. And, of course, after Robin and Barney broke up midway through season 5, after dating for a few weeks, there was no real development of their relationship, and in many ways, Barney showed how much of an idiot he was to Robin, both as a boyfriend and also as an ex-boyfriend, with that whole super date nonsense. And even that proposal in season 8 was the result of nothing but manipulation, deceit, and trickery to try to get her to marry him. And many people, mind you, have defended that proposal, calling it one of the most beautiful moments in the series' history, by saying that, yes, it might have been manipulative, but the reason why he did that is because He knew Robin inside out, and it was the only way he knew how to propose. He didn't want to be anything other than himself because he believed in his heart that Robin did love him for that. He just needed to make sure that Robin knew that and understood that. But people often forget that Barney Stinson always gets the yes, or at least most of the time. And I mentioned, of course, that his affection towards Robin was founded mainly on sex. We also can't forget the fact that during Ted's wedding to Stella, he actually was concocting a plan to try to get Robin drunk and sleep with her. Sickening. Now, I can be open-minded and say that yes, as the seasons went by, Robin did start to develop some feelings and some love for Robin, but the simple fact of the matter is he never valued her or cherished her the way Ted did or Kevin did. And so when they eventually got married, there were so many issues as well, so more red flags in their engagement and their marriage, which a lot of people just simply ignore because they loved the fact that their dream couple were getting together. But, you know, their relationship simply didn't have a proper foundation. Their engagement and marriage had no proper foundation. And every time they would supposedly resolve some of those issues, you know, something else would just come up and completely drive a wedge between them. And it started, of course, with Barney being forced to admit that he didn't burn that playbook, but he in fact kept an extra copy, and that pretty much summed up that whole proposal as nothing but a lie and a con. And then there were so many more ridiculous incidents during the engagement up to the marriage, which completely made Robin irritated and wonder whether or not she was making a mistake by marrying him. Let's talk about one incident. I think it's last time in New York, where Barney's father, Jerome Whittaker, and his new wife come all the way to Farhampton for the marriage and catch up with him. And Jerome ends up meeting Loretta Stinson, and they share sort of a formal greeting with a little peck of the cheek. And then Barney Stinson talks about how they could be getting back together. Now, of course, the backstory is, as many of you know, Jerome Whittaker was Barney's birth father, but he walked out on him. Barney always knew him as Uncle Jerome and Crazy Jerry. He never knew him as his birth father until he was in his 30s, and that also contributed in many ways to his dissipated childhood and his own, and the angst that he had. And his efforts to try to get Jerome and Loretta back together involved sending Jerome's wife on some sort of parasailing expedition, which really was an attempt to get rid of her. And that song, that montage which they had, where Barney would imagine Loretta and Jerome reuniting, pretty much summed it all up. Reunited, going so strong, Jerome's wife died parasailing, and he moved on. Notwithstanding the fact that with his new wife he had 2 children, Barney didn't care about that. Because their Barney boy would always be near, he'd come to live with them, and it wouldn't be weird. Of course not, love. And so back together and forever they'd be, Mum and Dad, and Barney makes 3. And what about Robin? Oh, she'd lived there too because she was married to him and was totally cool with it. Eventually, of course, that was resolved, but that was mainly thanks to Robin, who made him see the error of his ways and made him realise that with James going through a divorce, it was right that, Loretta and Sam Gibbs, James's father, would reunite, because that would be what James needed, because Barney was already going to marry Robin. And of course, in that particular episode, at the very beginning, when Robin warns him about the stupidity of his plan because Jerome was already married to someone else, his words were, well, marriage is just a piece of paper. And her reply is, I'm a lucky girl. So you can imagine as well that level of immaturity that Robin had and how Robin had to struggle with that. And eventually she was, in fact, willing to run out of that on that marriage, after finding out that Barney had lied to her about finding that locket, which was supposed to be the one thing that would calm her down and send her off serenely into marriage, knowing that she could be at peace with everything. Eventually they got married after Barney became more honest and told her about the locket, but he still was in many ways immature, and that immaturity played out in that marriage, where he was never really willing to appreciate Robin's constant working. And if he really loved Robin, he would have understood that. He knew the risks, and he spent most of that time during his marriage doing nothing but writing in his blog and complain about not being in New York after eventually leaving his job at the bank. And so it panned that relationship, far from being a very successful relationship that only lasted 3 years. It really was a relationship that was never meant to happen. And the fact that Barney would say that is really an example of how he was in denial. And the way Robin looked at him was pretty much proof of that. He had become more honest, but was never able to grow up, and that's why he simply wasn't meant to be with Robin, and Robin wasn't meant to be with him. And the love and that relationship never gave Robin any sense of peace or tranquility. In fact, it's quite fair to say that he brought out the worst in her, because she became loud, screechy, and very irritable. Her wonderful personality in the first few seasons was actually destroyed in many ways just so that she could get with Barney. Thankfully, thankfully it didn't really work out that way, but it did work out that Ted and Robin ended up together. And again, there were so many struggles that Ted and Robin had. And I go back to that whole "it's nice to be needed" thing. What people don't realize is that Robin needed Ted a lot. Of course she leaned on him. Of course she depended on him. And that scene in the car before Robin went up to the top of that building to confront Barney with that proposal, I think 44 Excalibur nailed it brilliantly when he said that was an example of how Robin and Barney were never able to exist as a couple independent of Robin's relationship with Ted. So you can see that Robin's relationship with Ted was the real core of the series. That, perhaps a little bit more than Lily and Marshall, because neither of them were telling the story of How I Met Your Mother. And us Ted and Robin fans, we got to see the magic of that relationship in season 2. We got to see how they evolved as ex-lovers who became really close friends, who struggled to try and let each other go. And one thing which I really find horrible is how people are only willing to give Barney a free pass for that wedding failing, but criticize Robin so much for being selfish. Again, she wasn't selfish. I mean, she was ambitious, she wanted to work a lot, but it always takes two to tango. And in many ways, what people don't seem to realize is that the love that Ted gave her was the love she wanted, but she also wanted to have a lot more things out of life. And that's sort of how that's the way it really panned out. But when it came to what made her happy, it was her relationship with Ted that made her happy. Her relationship with Kevin was second. Not a close second, but definitely second, because in many ways Kevin was a bit like Ted. And people will always point to that scene in No Pressure where Ted was told by Robin that she didn't love him. Her exact reaction was, no. So you can see she didn't really look at him when she said that. You could see that she wasn't being truthful. And of course, in the beginning of that episode, after Ted told her that he loved her and would be willing to overlook her infertility for her, she ended up sharing a passionate kiss with him, realizing that the love and passion that she had for him had returned. So how do you go from that to telling Ted that she didn't love him? Simple. She was lying to him. She didn't want him to give up his dream of having children, and so she wanted him to try and move on from him. And that's how you think and understand a series like How I Met Your Mother. You understand that certain things are not quite the way they are. You ask yourself why things are the way they are, and you come to that deduction, or else just, again, enjoy it while it lasts and don't assume anything. So in the end, of course, Ted and Robin ended up together the way it was meant to be, the way they were meant to be, because they always came back to each other. And that was the way it was. And of course, in The Time Travelers, with 2035 Ted wearing a wedding ring, it can be deduced that with Robin having rekindled that spark, with Robin having established herself as a crucial part of Ted's family now, they eventually did get married. And that's how Ted's prophecy came true in the pilot. It was never a puppy phase relationship, as a lot of people will say. It was a relationship that made both of them happy at that time, a relationship which sustained their friendship as they grew and evolved. And Ted said it best. There is no talk about a top 5 list of girlfriends, because there is no top 5. There's just a top 1, and it's Robin Scherbatsky. And he never completely let go of her. He unlearnt a lesson he had learnt as a child, that if you love something, you can't let it go. The new lesson is what Khalil Gibran would say. If you love something or you love someone, let that person go. That person comes back to you, it's yours forever. Of course, if that person doesn't come back, it wasn't meant to be, but the story dictated that she would come back to him. They'd always find their way back to one another. Maktub, as Paulo Coelho would say in The Alchemist. Of course, that's Arabic and Coelho is Brazilian Portuguese, but you can see that connection, okay? It's wonderful how so many elements of classic literature have been brought in to How I Met Your Mother. And that's what gave that series so much depth and so much significance. Something almost allegorical. And that's something that Friends never really had. I mean, don't get me wrong, I will watch Friends for some slapstick comedy moments and maybe a few emotional scenes, but if I want some emotional inspiration, I'll always watch How I Met Your Mother. Now, we're going to talk about the third person, the third aspect of why the finale was so hated, and that is the mother, Tracy McConnell. This is a lady who, in the eyes of many women, was Ted's perfect woman. The one who Ted loved and cherished so much. The one who gave Ted the children and the family life he always wanted. The person who always deserved better. The person who made him become a better person, who gave him so much happiness, and who was so much better for him in many ways, such a better fit than Robin Scherbatsky could have ever been. And the fact that she was never mentioned in the series, there was such a huge build-up towards he meeting her, and after all of those wonderful moments in season 9, she was just taken away, with her tragic death. It was a slap in the face to the fans, apparently. What people don't realize was that Tracy was portrayed as having been dead at the time Ted started telling that story. She passed away in 2024, and Ted started telling that story in 2030. And there were so many clues and hints leading up to her death. And if you were to look up Himian foreshadowing on YouTube, you'd find so many clues. And one clue which a lot of people, including myself, never really picked up on was, never mind the fact that Tracy was hardly ever mentioned in the first 2 seasons, maybe once or twice. Even after that, whenever she was mentioned, it would always be in the past tense, never in the present tense. Whereas Ted would always mention that Robin is a fan of Halloween and signify the fact that Robin was indeed a part of their lives in the present. And so, in a series which was titled How I Met Your Mother, it was just amazing how there was no mention of the mother, how she hardly ever even existed, and how we never heard so much of her or saw enough of her to really form that sort of a connection in many ways. And as it went on, many people, myself not included, I will admit, started to formulate the theory that maybe it was a story about how, she wouldn't really be in the picture. It was really about, someone else. But there were some other people who were just so excited about the build-up, about the supposed build-up, who wanted to meet her, who apparently fell in love with her before anyone was signed on to play her because of all the glorious, charitable, wonderful things that Ted said about her. And yet many of them could never consider the idea that the reason why he was saying all those things was an attempt to pay homage to her for his children. He had already told them the story of how he had met Tracy so many times, but this one was a little bit different because it started with how he met Aunt Robin, their de facto stepmother. And the biggest problem with Tracy was that, in many ways, as 44 Excalibur would say, and I think I might have repeated this, she was nothing more than a representation of everything that he had been doing wrong. And, you know, their relationship really only took hold in season 9 after she made her appearance, after Kristen Milioti made her appearance in the last 20 seconds of season 8 when she was buying a ticket to Farhampton. And so we saw in season 9 a few select clips of how they met, their first date and so forth. And it was always told that, you know, Ted's ideal woman was someone who played the bass guitar and someone who would tick off so many items on his checklist. It was a representation in many ways of what he had been doing wrong, searching for that perfect love. Maybe in some ways the fact that Tracy was, you know, everything that Ted supposedly ever wanted at that time was the way of the universe working itself out for him. But of course at that time he wasn't so picky. But even then, you know, all we had was about 25 minutes approximately of Ted and Tracy in season 9, a few generous, glorious comments that Ted made about her as a means of paying homage to her, and yet that led people to believe that they were so much a better couple, apparently one of the most convincing couples ever seen on television, and that they had to end up together in the end. And the fact that Tracy was taken away was a slap in the face to many of the viewers who loved her so much, who supposedly fell in love with her. But then here's the thing. The writers never intended for the viewers to fall in love with Tracy. Their idea was basically to have Tracy show up at the very end, and that's it. That's how the series would end. Interestingly enough, both Bays and Thomas made an appearance at their alma mater, Wesleyan College, which is, of course, the college setting for Ted Mosby and Marshall Erickson. And you get an idea that both of those two were sort of based on the lives of both Bays and Thomas. And they were talking in that session, and I might, you know, share the link to that in my description or maybe in some other comment, about how they wanted to try to experiment in the 9th season by stretching the wedding for as long as they could and also making Tracy more of a character and giving her a few more scenes. The idea was that maybe you'd get a few scenes of her as a bit of a montage, if you will, and it would be sort of enough to just, you know, let people know that she was there, let people know the role she played, and just say, you know, this was it. And it sort of gave her sort of a shooting star effect, which was nice in some ways, but not so nice in other ways. It was good in many ways that they were able to expand her character to make sure that she was nothing more than a plot device. I mean, she was more than just a plot device, rather. But they also, in many ways, gave her just a little bit too much screen time to truly make her indelible. And here's the thing, though. The only reason why Tracy McConnell would end up being so indelible in people's minds is because, you know, she was the titular mother. If the series hadn't been named How I Met Your Mother, she would have just been a plot device. She never had any mentions, as I said, in the first 2 seasons. She had a few sporadic, selective mentions as the seasons went by. 8 seasons went by without so much of an appearance from her, and yet people were so eager to, you know, meet her. I will credit some fans who eventually picked up on a lot of foreshadowing clues that she would pass away. The biggest clue at the time being the 45-day speech in The Time Travelers as well, where Ted said to his children that he would never have gone to, if he could relive that day, he would never go to Robots versus Wrestlers. He'd first go to his home. He'd go and visit Marshall and Lily and Robin and Barney. But again, none of those things were the things he'd do first. The children knew what he would do first. And we would see him run all the way to Tracy's apartment. He knew where Tracy lived because, of course, in a huge twist of fate, he dated Tracy's roommate, Cindy. And when he got to that apartment, he would make that speech where he said, in 45 days, we're going to meet and have 2 children. We're going to fall in. I mean, we're going to meet. We're going to fall in love. We're going to get married and have 2 children, and we're going to love our children so much. And all that's only 45 days away. But I'm here because I want those 45 days with you. And if I can't have those 45 days, I'll take 45 seconds before your boyfriend were to show up and punch me right in the face. Now that speech itself, is in many ways a big hint. At first you might think, oh, what a beautiful speech, which signifies how much love he had for his wife. But then you start to think about that and realize something's a bit off here. Why would he speak so passionately, with tears in his eyes, about wanting an extra 45 days or 45 seconds with Tracy if they're still together and happily married? What difference would those days make? You really would only say something like that if you know that a person may not be here for very long. Maybe Tracy would be dead. And when you think about why that's being said, when you think about all of those things, you understand that that's not simply a declaration of love for his wife, but nothing more than basically Ted telling what he would have done had he known then what he knew now, that his wife would be tragically dead. And so you can't talk of this build-up to meeting Tracy when you have an idea that she's going to die in the end. And of course, if you see the ending of Vesuvius, when she asks Ted what mother is going to miss her daughter's wedding, that look from Ted Mosby said it all. And it confirmed that Tracy was going to die and that she would be dead. And yet people still love the alternate ending because it talks about how Ted and Tracy are together. That alternate ending is nothing but a joke. I'm sorry to say that, but that's the truth. And so you sort of get the idea that that's how Tracy's character was effectively made. And Ted and Tracy's relationship effectively was, in stark contrast to Ted and Robin, was in many ways just, brought together at the very last moment. All we basically had of Ted and Tracy were a few glorious comments in the 25-minute highlights reel. Tracy also had an episode by herself, How Your Mother Met Me, and that was pretty much it. There was never going to be any of that sort of relationship development. We were never going to see how they would resolve any arguments they had or really, really, really struggle with bringing up the children. We had a few small clips, and that was just it. It was so disjointed in many ways. And so, as much as I really did like Ted and Tracy, I was never going to, necessarily root for them to be together at the end, although I wouldn't have minded necessarily them ending together at the time. As the series went on, I knew, as I started rewatching the series again and going over everything, I realized that, Ted and Tracy, as wonderful as they were simply, not meant to last together, because that was not the way how the story was written. That last episode, as 44 Excalibur said, is called Last Forever because, Ted thought that Tracy would be his forever love. But then, after her passing, he had to move on. And he was able to reunite with Robin to make that love last forever. And that was sort of the way it was written. Because they'd always loved one another, and they got back together. And that made it happy. The ending was beautiful. It might have had some elements of a fairy tale ending, but in many ways, there was a lot of realism to it. And, given how many high school sweethearts, separated by circumstances would reunite in their 70s or 80s, it happens. So it doesn't happen often, but it's not unrealistic by any means. And so that's sort of the way it is with Ted and Tracy. I mean, yeah, they had a good relationship. Yes, they had 2 children. And after Tracy moved on from losing Max and Ted moved on from losing Robin to marrying Barney, they discovered one another, they ended up forming a life together, and they ended up becoming loves of of each other's lives. But the main point of the story is that just because you move on, you never allow yourself to forget the love you once had. Ted would never forget Robin. I mean, obviously he would never think of cheating on Tracy with Robin. He wouldn't spend time thinking, what if? And that's how happy he was. And although Tracy was blissfully happy with Ted, she never let Max leave her heart either. And I'm not going to say that Max and Tracy are a wonderful couple because we never saw anything of Max, but we knew the way Max was portrayed, that he was also the person who made Tracy so happy. And that's sort of how it worked out. Tracy had two great loves of her life in Max and Ted. Ted had two great loves of his life in Tracy and Robin, or Robin and Tracy, whichever order. And so I talk about Max as well because there is also one particular argument which a lot of these Tracy fans make in terms of defending Tracy and Ted's relationship, saying, here's the thing here. There is one person who, with whom I had at times, I would say a rather niggly discussion on this. This is actually based on another video where they talked about the alternate ending. And this is basically what he said. Coming to that right now. Yep, here it is. So, and this is what this person said. A person who is a writer who was very critical of Bays and Thomas for supposedly violating their contract with the audience and the work they did just because they wanted to stay true to their vision. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. And what this person said was, because Bays and Thomas wrote Ted to genuinely and deeply love the mother and to have been very happy with her and cherished that time together, the story was just as much about Tracy as it was theirs. But by having Ted present the story as how I met your deceased mother, and then ending the story with, I guess, was really about me and Robin, it cheapens that time they had together, and it makes Tracy seem like someone who settled for who could give him what Robin couldn't or wouldn't. And it certainly makes him seem stupid for running back to a woman who never appeared to love or appreciate him the way he wanted or needed to be. A perfect example here of a completely flawed, and I would definitely say ignorant take. Because maybe the writers didn't show you that, but you were expected to pick up on those hints, you were expected to pay attention, and you were expected to do that. And a lot of these fans of Ted and Tracy would say, I did pay attention. I watched the whole series. I watched the whole DVD. I saw the clues. I saw the hints. And yet they completely disregard those clues and hints when putting their points forward out of their own sense of self-righteousness. You see, I'm not naming this person, but it gives me a chance to, completely let rip. Yeah. And so, people talk about how, Ted and Tracy were just so much superior because of everything that Ted said about her and the moments they had. But then, whenever these fans are asked whether they'd say those things if Ted and Tracy hadn't had those moments together in the 9th season, if Tracy had only showed up for 20 seconds and with that the series would end, would they say any of that? I'm going to talk about a friend of mine, Ori Feldman, who loved Ted and Tracy and Barney and Robin. And he was a lot more measured when he said, of course, I fell in love with Tracy before, anyone was signed on to play her. Ted told me everything I needed to hear. And, they made me, whatever Ted said made me feel that way about Ted and Tracy. They made me feel that way when I saw them together in the 9th season. So what can I do? And so, if you're willing to truly articulate and accept, alternate arguments and sort of at least keep an open mind to say that maybe in some ways there could be an alternate explanation to this, then that's fine. But when things have been disproved so heavily and you still stick to your narrative, I can't have any respect for you. I'm sorry. And so that brings me back to that statement. Because Tracy was portrayed as this way, the story was as much about her. No, it wasn't about her. She never made an appearance for 8 seasons. She was hardly mentioned in the first 2 seasons, as I've said. And again, if the story hadn't been titled How I Met Your Mother, if the series hadn't been titled How I Met Your Mother, she would have just been a plot device. Simple as that. And of course, None of us are also saying that by that logic, Tracy's story was every bit about Max as well. No. I mean, look, we appreciate Max as the love of Tracy's life, who sadly died, but we're not going to be that crass as to, go all the way back into that and sort of make assumptions on what sort of a person Max was. But he did have an influence on Tracy. And that ukulele which he gifted her, she would go on to keep. A sign that he would never leave her heart. How else would she be able to sing La Vie en Rose to her children in that hauntingly beautiful way that Ted described? And that's going to segue now into another issue, and thankfully the final one, because I just realized that I've gone over an hour. I never wanted to go that long. This last issue talks about, in many ways, how the writers screwed over the characters, slapped the fans in the face, and how they should have deviated from their vision entirely and changed their ending to suit the fans' desires and do it according to the reaction of the fans. I also want to shout out this fine person, a Bonnie. That's Alpha, Bravo, Oscar, November, November, Yankee, or Yukon if you live in Canada. And in an earlier video, which I don't think is on YouTube anymore, he made an amazing point. If you are trying to tell a story, you have to tell it your way. And if you are an artist, the fans of your work should never be allowed to influence your work in any way. You should have the right to convey what you want to say, tell your story the way you want to do, and if the fans mess with it, it'll signal the death of art and the beginning of commercialization. Now, there are a lot of people who will say, well, that's just the way the TV industry is. You've got to work according to the fans. But Him Yim, or How I Met Your Mother, that is, wanted to be different. They wanted to establish themselves as a comedy which was similar to Friends, but in many ways very different. And you can see, once you watch the series, you can see in many ways why it's different. Bays and Thomas wanted to give us something a lot more poignant, a lot more meaningful, wrapped in the veneer of comedy. And in many ways, it was somewhat allegorical. In fact, they based their story, as I've mentioned, I think I might have mentioned it, I don't know. Maybe I haven't. They did. I did. They based their story on the classic tale Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And that was mentioned at the beginning of the series and near the end of the series as Ted's favorite book. So that actually served as a perfect clue as to how the story would end. A perfect example of a storytelling principle known as Chekhov's gun, named after Anton Chekhov, the Russian playwright, who said quite brilliantly, "If you say in the beginning of the story that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, you must fire that rifle by the end of the story, or it shouldn't be hanging there." And that's how important that clue was, and also how important the blue French horn was, because that began and ended the story. And so Bays and Thomas actually, took the craft of storytelling to a new level, and they also had their own ways of experimenting with the story, as I mentioned in that talk at Wesleyan College. Their style is not lazy, as a lot of people would say. Calling that lazy is lazy in itself, as far as I'm concerned. Their style is non-linear. They have flashbacks, flash forwards, they dump in many clues and hints which, you gloss over, but, you are challenged as a member of the audience to think about all of those things and ask yourself why those things are being told and what contributions those things are making towards the story in a way. And so, as I've said, the best way to watch a story like How I Met Your Mother, a series like How I Met Your Mother, is to either pay close attention to everything or just enjoy it while it lasts and let it wash over you. And then you also try to keep an open mind about why things are the way they are. And so, while the ending obviously did cause a lot of anger and pain to many fans who adored Barney and Robin and who were reeling over their divorce, who adored Ted and Tracy and who were reeling over Tracy's death, so many people who watched the series from the beginning, who knew how it was going to end, who followed all those clues, they had nothing but praise for the way that story was structured, and Bays and Thomas did do a good job. All this talk about character development and how the story completely deviated from its premise is utter nonsense, because there were so many clues and so many hints. And all this talk about, stories evolving and so much character development, again, that's just bollocks. Because again, good writers who are in control of their story will never allow it to drift from what they want to convey or represent. I mean, that development can perhaps, add a little layer to the story, if you will, but it never takes away from the main premise. And this segues back to Dawson's Creek. Kevin Williamson and his team originally had an idea for Dawson, played by James Van Der Beek, Simon Tremblay on How I Met Your Mother, and Katie Holmes, who played Naomi, that, promiscuous pumpkin, to end up together. But instead, Katie Holmes, who played Joey, ended up with Pacey instead of Dawson. And yet Dawson and Joey ended up having a lot of the development from the very beginning. And many people have been willing to praise Kevin Williamson and company for the courage that they showed in completely changing their story, because they believed it didn't fit the tone anymore. But that's just a load of bollocks. And pardon my language. The simple fact is it's a cop-out, because if you wanted Dawson and Joey to end up together, if you wanted to portray them as a couple that were meant to be together despite all of those setbacks, you had a beautiful narrative which had never been compromised. The main reason here is because, the reason why they did this, the only thing that can be said, it's rather simple. Many fans simply didn't like Dawson and Joey together. And I think the fans made it very clear that they preferred seeing Joey with Pacey. So maybe Kevin Williamson and his team decided, the way things are going, we might as well just do that sort of bait and switch. Not a bait and switch. We might as well just change it, let the fans be happy, and completely be done with it. And apparently, some of the cast members were happy with it, others weren't. What was crucial about How I Met Your Mother, though, is that although Bays and Thomas did have a few issues about whether they should end it the way they did, eventually and thankfully they took the responsible, correct and logical decision, the intellectual decision, to end it the way they did, with Ted and Robin ending up together, with Barney and Robin divorcing, with Tracy dying, because that was the only way to satisfy all of the clues and ensure closure and leave no stone unturned. They did actually they did create an alternate ending and release that, which was nothing but a stupid, lazy, no-effort recut to appease fans who didn't like Tracy's death and who didn't like seeing Barney and Robin divorced, with that line, things get taken apart and put back together, providing some hope. And what those people don't realize is that in that finale, Barney and Robin are still more or less divorced, and they're no longer in love with one another. So why would you want to put them back together, for heaven's sake? But the issue here is that Bays and Thomas deserve credit for sticking to their guns and telling their story their way. If they had ended it another way, it would have been an absolute rip-off, and they would have been derided as nothing but, spineless fan panderers who only cared about TRP ratings. Now, it is quite pertinent to note that, the way the ratings had been going since season 6 and 7, how they weren't exactly, over the roof. The fact that the ending ended up being panned by so many people was just more or less expected in a way. But again, if they had ended it with the alternate ending, it would have just left so many questions unanswered. And when you make so much of an effort to base a series on a story, if you want to tell a story in its entirety, you have got to stick to it until the end. And I'm also sick of people who, in their own self-righteousness as writers themselves, talk about how Bays and Thomas displayed a lack of integrity by going with that ending, and how that ending simply had no integrity. In fact, Mr. Grondin himself talked about how not only did the ending disregard the tone, but a different ending would have lent so much more in terms of meaning to it. And some of these people, mind you, are such sadists that they actually believe that Ted should have ended up alone. Grondin himself spoke about how his ideal ending would have been Ted going to Robin's window, looking up at her, and then Robin shutting the window on him, saying no. And then he would go back and hug his children and say, you know what? As long as I have you in my life, that's enough. I have the memories of Tracy and that'll be fine. And that ending, again, would have been just completely tragic with no happy closure for Ted or even Robin. And why would you start the series by talking about how Ted met Robin? Why would you mention how important Robin was to the children and talk about how they rediscovered that spark and then all of a sudden just end it in that ambiguous way? And then you sure as hell can't have Ted trying to find love with a new girl because, again, for that very reason. I mentioned as well about how Robin became an important part of the children's lives. There was a school of thought, I will admit, that maybe, Robin was just being a good aunt, like the others, being close to the family, with Tracy's approval, because after all, Tracy did invite Robin to the wedding. But when it was told that Robin didn't conceive kids and didn't have children, you sometimes think about that as well and ask yourself, is it sensible to have Robin's childless ex in her 50s be nothing more than a glorified babysitter for his children? I remember thinking that at the time that wasn't so bad, but again, as you go back and think about it, you realize it just doesn't make any sense. And since there's no Uncle Barney in any of those drawings, you can conclude that she never really was able to settle down with him. And the only way that it would have been okay for Tracy to have been a part of, for Robin to be a part of the lives of the children, would either be if Robin was happily married, or if Tracy was about to die and Tracy wanted Ted to move on with Robin. And so those little things as well are the things you pick up on. So again, the original ending was the best ending. It was the ending that had the most integrity. Had Bays and Thomas instead gone with the alternate ending, they would have shown a lack of integrity. So I applaud them for sticking to their guns. And the fact that they haven't really been able to produce that much in terms of, work, the fact that they haven't really been involved in the How I Met Your Father spin-off is really hurtful. And that's just an example of how, misguided hate from fans can really be hurtful in many ways. But I want Bays and Thomas to work together again. I want to see them produce a series, and I will definitely look forward to watching it. Now, I remember saying, though, at the beginning that as much as the ending was a masterpiece, it wasn't perfect. There were so many things that Bays and Thomas did wrong. The entire 9th season, in a way, as they said at that meet at Wesleyan, was a big experiment, because they obviously wanted to experiment with the idea of, stretching a wedding. And of course, at that wedding, Ted would meet Tracy. So how about a huge twist? Have Robin and Barney get married? In many ways, they were a little bit too clever, perhaps. And because they stretched out that wedding for so long over the course of that season, they ended up introducing all of these episodes like Bedtime Stories, Night Visions, and Slapsgiving 3, which quite simply were just filler episodes. I mean, don't get me wrong, I did enjoy seeing Lin-Manuel Miranda in Bedtime Stories. That little rap cameo was good. And Boys to Men in Slapsgiving 3 was also okay, although it will never be Boys to Men without Michael McCary in his bass voice. You gotta have that depth. But as I've said, those episodes were just filler episodes. It took away so much in terms of screen time, which could have been used to pace the story a lot more sensibly. And, there could have been a lot more effort in many ways shown in seeing Ted and Tracy, getting to grips with family life, showing Tracy struggle a bit more with her illness. And to that point, there were actually 18 minutes from the finale, which are there on the DVD, but were cut from the televised version, which would have lent a lot in terms of piecing all of that together. Even if the finale had been something like a 60 to 90 minute spectacular with so many things mentioned in that would have been fantastic. So we can definitely say that Bays and Thomas didn't really pace the ninth season very well. In many ways, I think they allowed themselves to become a little bit too clever. And it also segues into an interview that Bays did with a French entertainment channel, where apparently he was quoted as saying that if he could do it all over again, he wouldn't use the original ending and that he liked the alternate ending better. And that has been used, mind you, as a piece of hope by so many people who will say this: if Bays himself regretted not going for the alternate ending, then that says it all. They should have used the alternate ending. Again, not only is the alternate ending utterly stupid, not only does the alternate ending go against the main premise of Tracy McConnell being dead. I mean, I already mentioned many of the reasons why that couldn't be used, but Bays was smart enough as a storyteller to know that that couldn't happen. And in an interview in print, he said specifically, "I do regret the fact that Tracy McConnell died. I do regret the fact that we had to kill her. And I did like the alternate ending better as a fan. And as it went on, I would have wanted to see Ted and Tracy end up together. But after the discussion that we all had, intellectually and logically, we had to use the original ending. And I am actually very proud of that, because it would be very easy to be swayed by the reaction of the fans. And that is the crux of it. Storytellers have a right to tell their story. And if it alienates some of the fans, so be it. Because let's not forget, Ted Mosby is a fan of Bertolt Brecht, the German playwright. And the main aim of Brecht's work is to alienate the audience. I love how things come together so well. So, I've gone over 90 minutes now, and I should apologize to all of you, but I hope this will give you an idea of why I absolutely enjoyed the ending, and why I believe it ended the right way, and why to this day I will still happily watch How I Met Your Mother in syndication or any other way. In fact, when I get some money, I'm going to make sure that I buy the complete edition in DVD, so that I can watch all of those scenes that were cut from the televised versions as well. Because the way the story was told, with so many layers for all of the characters, you see how beautiful it is. You see the effort that goes into making a series like that. You see the effect of the story, how allegorical it is, how it's true to real life. Of course, a lot of people will say, it can't be true to real life because the characters are so damn unrealistic. But here's the thing. As unrealistic as characters may be, it's a bit like the Shakespeare poem, all the world's a stage. All the men and the women are merely players. And everyone goes through the same emotions and feelings as everyone else. Whether you're a former teenage pop star from Canada, or whether you're an incorrigible womanizer, or whether you had a movie made about you in a rather unflattering way, or whatever it may be. But the thing is, Him Yim was true to life. It was a beautiful series which had so many beautiful layers. I was delighted seeing Ted and Robin reunite. I was happy for Marshall and Lily. And with Barney having his child, that was the high point of his development. He became a lot more mellowed, and you could see, although it might not have been explicitly shown, you could see that that was when he started to become a better person. And that is, again, a perfect example of how the character development is true to the character in person and how they react well to it. So, I've spoken at length about how all of this criticism about how Bays and Thomas did their job is just utter stupidity, and how all this talk about how stories are so organic and how they change and how the writing rebels and how characters take on different directions. Here's the thing, the writers will always be in control. And yes, Bays and Thomas might have allowed their story to drift in some ways, but they knew the ending they wanted to show. They knew the story they wanted to convey, and they deserve credit for that. And if people aren't willing to see that, well, again, you've got to look at everything in its totality. If you form an opinion, even after looking at everything, I suppose I can respect that. But when people refuse to even consider anything, when people refuse to go from their view, despite how it's been disproved, when people aren't willing to keep that much of an open mind, then it's not really worth having any sort of a conversation with those people. Those guys are just bitter. They think they know a lot about storytelling, but the fact is, they're in no position whatsoever to criticize Bays and Thomas for the job that they did. Those two showed integrity by going with the original ending. It was a masterpiece. It was the best way to end it. True story. And the fact that neither of those two are involved with How I Met Your Father is absolutely disappointing. And there has been talk about possibly bringing those characters back for a 10th season of How I Met Your Mother. I don't know if I'm in favor of that. With all of those characters having ended the series in a really good place, the idea of bringing them back, if it means having them go through the motions again, if it means introducing a seismic change that would completely upset the apple cart, I believe Lisa Kudrow mentioned that as a reason why she would never want to do a Friends movie or a Friends revival. And so that's how it would work with How I Met Your Mother. I know that Jason Segel, ironically, he didn't want to do the 9th season because he had wanted to move on, and now he's been one of those people who's actively saying, I'm in, let me back in. How would that story be structured? If that story was structured in such a way that it would, fill in some of the holes and talk about, Ted and Tracy getting to grips with married life, Robin and Barney continuing to struggle and realizing that they're not meant to be, that they're not a good fit at all, once and for all, and Marshall and Lily, also getting to grips with their family life and really, having even bigger changes with Marshall becoming a state Supreme Court judge and Lily mellowing into a devoted wife and mother. As long as it doesn't completely change that established storyline, I suppose it could be okay, but even then, I'm not too sure I'd be eager to do that. I think, don't get me wrong, if you want to have that revival to make sure you do it the way you want and the way it's meant to be done, that's fine. I mean, they tried that with Gilmore Girls, and apparently a lot of people said that felt a little bit awkward. But the writers, again, had the right to do what they wanted, and if they wanted to make sure that the story was resolved their way, then fine. And with Bays and Thomas agreeing that, Himium was resolved in the right way, why would you want to do that? And especially if they're not going to be involved in that 10th season, I'm pretty sure that wouldn't happen, and I hope and pray it doesn't happen. I think there has been an attempt to try to fill some holes with Kobe Smulders making her guest appearance on How I Met Your Father, where she would meet Hilary Duff's character in 2022 and talk about the events in her life. By that time, she had been divorced from Barney for a few years, 4 years in fact, and she had seen Ted marry Tracy, having been invited to that wedding. And so her advice was sound. Timing is always everything. And that did help plug some of the gaps. It also gave people an idea that Robin wasn't really this cold-hearted witch that people think she was. In fact, it sickens me, really. A lot of these people who are willing to criticize her are just a bunch of misogynists. That's all I can say. I mean, on one hand, they love the fact that she's, independent, strong, a tomboy, basically, but they can't, and they do like her ambition, but they can't stand her being this person who achieves so much more and apparently doesn't even bother to have time to devote to her childish husband who expects his wife to be a mother figure to her. As I've said, her character was in the framing, and it was framed beautifully, with so many different layers, resolved well in the finale, as was Barney's, as was Ted's, and as was Lily's and Marshall's. And that's just the way it was. So again, I have been going on for a little bit too long, but I think I'll probably take about 5 more minutes and then I'll end it. And let me apologize for the length of this video. If any of you do manage to see this whole thing and listen to me and completely agree, I only hope that my voice was clear enough for all of you. If there are any of you who agree with me, those of you who truly appreciate what I have to say, I'm so grateful to all of you. And I know that there are going to be a lot of you who will disagree with what I have to say and will definitely have a lot to say about that. I welcome debate. But again, keep it civilized. That's all I'll say. And yeah, with 5 minutes to go, I am going to say that, I don't really know what I can say. I really don't. I guess what I should say is I want to thank all of those people who have replied favorably to a lot of my comments on YouTube, and especially thank quite a few of those people who have said that I should make a video. In fact, I also want to mention that rainbow girl Ash, who also has made quite a few videos talking about why Robin and Ted should be together, although thankfully her videos are a lot more short, nowhere near detailed. I think one of the issues that I'm going to have now is that because it's so long and I've said so much, many of you are going to get bored. So if you do get bored, I completely understand. That's no real issue. That's perfectly okay. I'm going to have to learn to make things a little bit shorter from here on in. I really wanted to talk about the main issues as to why people hated the finale so much, and I'd like to think that I've articulated them well enough. And I've loved How I Met Your Mother as a series, which would, people often say that it's a rip-off of Friends, and yet what people don't realize is that if they had ended it with the alternate ending, that's all it would have been. Nothing but a cheap sellout attempt to garner TRP ratings and leave the fans satisfied without, any regard for the vision and the story that you've had. And Barney said it brilliantly: if a sweet ending doesn't make sense, it cannot be satisfying. And when the actors themselves have approved of that ending, that should, end the matter. I mean, Alison Hannigan did say that, the ending could have been done a lot better and there were a few things left out that should have been added. But overall, everyone's reaction was completely positive. And perhaps the best example of this was NPH himself going on The Late Show with David Letterman to talk about that finale and saying that, that's the way Barney's character panned out. You wanted to be that person you could bring your mum home to meet, but sadly he's the bugger who wants to sleep with your mum. And it just highlights the fact that although people might be willing to change, they may not be willing to grow up, and it's only when you grow up that you start to change. And Letterman said it perfectly. Nobody has any right to be angry with the ending, because as long as it was being shown on terrestrial television, you got the damn show for free. And if you couldn't accept that's the way it had to end, you just weren't paying any attention. Again, there were some people who did pay attention but just didn't like it. Well, as you've seen, I have a lot to say about those people. But I want to say right now that was a wonderful series. which did a terrific job of analysing human emotions and human psyches and how people are sort of wired in a way. And that's why I'll always want to watch that series in its totality, including the original ending. The less said about that alternate ending, the better. It was a waste of time, utterly stupid. And I want to see Carter Bays and Craig Thomas work together again. I want to see them produce another a series or some other piece of work. And if they do produce another series again, I will definitely watch it, because they've really broken the mold when it comes to storytelling by showing us that it doesn't need to be straightforward. It can be, non-linear. It can take us for a ride. And with so many episodes having a bait and switch, it was only natural that that bait and switch would happen at the ending in a way. But it was perhaps a little jarring and overdone, but on the whole, I must applaud them for staying true to their vision, and they did stay true to their work. And, you're not going to make all of your audience happy, but you have to stay true to yourself. If you try to please everyone, no one's going to be pleased. And they showed a lot more they showed a lot more integrity as writers and producers than that for which people are willing to credit them. And for that, I want to offer them my support and say thank you both so much for producing such an amazing series, which still, for me, serves as, a ray of hope. And so we are going to come up to the 1 hour 45-minute mark. Thank you all once again for listening. Some of you have subscribed to my channel. There's not really much there to see, but I'm going to try and include a few more videos like this. You'll see me having some more talks about so many other issues. I may do some things differently. We'll see how it works. But once again, thanks a lot for listening, and enjoy yourselves. And of course, let me also pay tribute to Bob Saget, forever one of my favorite entertainers. Always Danny Tanner, always future Ted Mosby. Rest in peace, sir. We love you. As for the rest of you, bye.